know, it's quite easy to lose track in the regulation jungle. While animal husbandry is local by nature, it depends on a very complex system of international suppliers. National regulation acts very often as cumbersome and expensive for feed ingredient producers and also the traders. Our next speaker is the most competent person in this field. Let us welcome together Dr. Didier Jans, the Secretary General of FEFANA.
Thank you very much for these very kind words. I would like very much to thank the organizer, not only for the invitation to this meeting, but also for the initiative. I understood yesterday evening that this forum is blowing its 10 candles, and I think we owe some gratitude to Biomin for this initiative. They have succeeded to create a focal point that allows our industry to meet, to think, and to discuss important topics for our industry. So, thank you very much, Biomin, for this important initiative. As you were, most probably, I was very impressed by the forward-looking perspective that the two previous speakers have given to us. I have to say, my talk is going to be a bit more restrictive on the time scale. I'm only looking at about 10 years, and keep that for you. The reason for that is that I'm only a beginner in premonition. Still, 10 years for our industry is a very remote perspective for many of the operators. It was mentioned, and it's the reality. The time scale of our industry, its viability, and its practical run of operation is rather 3 months than anything else. So it requires quite open-minded and open-minding to go into the kind of reflection that we have here. And so with regulation, at least with my experience, looking at 10 years is already a huge challenge. So I'm working for FEFANA. FEFANA is the European Association of Specialty Feed Ingredients. So we represent the industry of feed additives and similar products. Biomin is an active member of this association. What we do, in fact, is to represent these companies. And what we realize is that many of these companies were not only playing in Europe, which is the focal area of our activity, but were also global operators. And what we realize with time is that anything that happens in a regulatory system anywhere in the world, sooner or later is going to have an impact on your operation in your country at the other end of the globe. So that's the reason why we pay some kind of and quite increasing attention to this global dimension of the regulation. The core activity of FEFANA is in regulatory business, so we are the representation of the industry to intervene and participate in the regulatory decision and basically development of law. But one of the characteristics of our organization is also to get active in the implementation. Once the rules are set, we help our members to understand them and to implement them in a proper way. And we don't stop this activity at the level of our members. We are also very close to the authorities, which are also struggling in the implementation of the rules that they establish themselves. We are also a member of IFIF, the International Feed Industry Federation, and this is very much the place where we are developing and operating our strategy regarding global regulatory questions. So, why an interest in global regulation? Clearly, the compound feed industry and the animal production are essentially local, but the feed industry clearly depends heavily on a complex range of international supplies. For the basic raw material, these supplies and the fluxes of these supplies is essentially determined by macro-geographic condition, physical aspect of the production area, being climate, land availability, without, of course, omitting some more political and economical trend in some regions. There are, of course, some macro evolutions in that respect, but more or less the picture is relatively stable, at least on a short and mid-term perspective. When we look at the specialty feed ingredients, the picture is probably even more intrinsically international. The value of these products allow them to travel, and in most of the cases, as we will see, they are much less dependent on the physical condition of the local circumstances. This implies that basically any regions or any production unit can find its place or even become dominant in the global map of supplies. The operators supplying the global demand for specialty feed ingredients can be more or less anywhere in the world. Of course, the resource, the physics of the production, the resource, the logistic and so on are important elements. But more than often, they are not the most determinant parameters to decide to install a production facility at such or such other place. Amongst the criteria that intervene and that you know, of course, is the know-how. What can you do with your know-how? Do you want to move your know-how or to keep it at the same place? The availability of workforces and the competence of these workforces, possibility to innovate, the legal environment in a country, the economic and politico-economic environment in a country, the social stability. So these are all the elements that intervene in the decision of the industry to install their facility at different places, and where the physics is only a small part of the picture to make the decisions. There are a number of examples already today where we see that the supplies of specialty feed ingredients have already segregated between operators and or between regions. There are some vitamins, for instance, which are almost exclusively produced for the entire world in China. There are other products like organic acid, which are predominantly produced in Europe for some of them. And for some other additives, for a number of reasons and the complexity of the parameters I described to you, they are produced more evenly all over the world. The common part of that is that there is already probably today no economy which is independent from the others as far as the supply of the specialty feed ingredient is concerned. And we could expect that this cross-dependence is going to increase further with the further increase of the animal production that we expect for the years to come. Whatever the exact figures, whether it's 10 billion, 8 billion, or whatever, it's clear that we are in front of a steep growing human population and a concomitant growing of demand for animal products. Again, we might discuss, but scarcity is a fact. It's already a fact today and is going to increase, or at least diversification of the resource is a key element of the animal production in the years to come. And on top of that, we have to add the complexity of the societal expectation regarding animal production. The result is that animal production is bound to efficacy. We have no choice. Of course, there are different paths for that. We are in a global assembly today. It's clear that one production system doesn't fit all circumstances. There are different production systems. There will be different production systems, quite different between places, regions, and conditions. But there is one common denominator to this production system for the future and for the efficacy is the key role of the specialty feed ingredients. And for these ingredients to have this key role, they need to be available. And that's the next step and the challenge which is coming to us. It's to make the specialty ingredient available anywhere in the world where they are necessary. The growth of the animal production is, of course, a very positive perspective for our industry and for the feed and the animal production industry in general. But it is critical from now to create the condition to allow, or at least to facilitate, the access to the market of these critical products and the possibility for them to move around the world at the pace where they need to be moved. So, are we going for a global harmonization of the legislation? Is it a must? Is it desirable? And somehow, how far is it feasible? I'm not going to conclude on that, and I leave that with you, but at least what I like to do is to share with you some reflection on the main obstacles in the way to a global harmonization. The first obstacle I would see is the asynchronous development of the thinking and of the regulatory system. I would take two examples. One of them has been mentioned already this morning. It's the antibiotic resistance concern. When you look what happens, we experienced a quite strong development on that in Europe about 10 years ago with the ban of the antibiotic growth promoter. The trend is somehow going on, and we see over the last months quite similar trends in other regions like US or Southeastern Asia. But there is order of magnitude of time difference. There are decades of difference in the way for countries to take that into account and to evolve in this direction. You would have said 10 years ago to the United States, ban the antibiotic growth promoter. I don't think that you would have many interlocutors or even anyone prepared to speak with you. Today, this exists, this developing in different countries. We need to leave the time to the people to make up their mind and move at their pace. I have another example which is developing very much in our field is the condition of production, so the hygiene condition of the production. If one compares to what started in Europe about 20 years ago with that, so the integration of HACCP and concepts like this, traceability, you might recognize that the same kind of thinking is now finding its way in the regulation of different regions, in particular United States and China. But again, there are 2 decades difference in the pace for this stuff to apply and to come into the regulation. Another obstacle is the complexity of the multi-party agreement. We all appreciate that the agreement, multi-party agreement in an international context are extremely difficult to negotiate. That takes ages to get to any kind of agreement and consensus there. This might explain to a certain extent why it seems that bilateral trade negotiations seems to get the favor of a number of countries nowadays compared to the big international rounds. But again, from a global harmonization of legislation perspective, this is raising a very big challenge because it means you have a multiplication of one-to-one negotiation that have an impact on the legislation that you need to coach and that you need then to bridge and to link to other one-to-one negotiations that have occurred. So all this makes that a global harmonization seems to be quite a remote objective. The Codex Alimentarius is clearly the first body that comes to mind when one is considering international coordination and harmonization of feed chain safety and regulation. There is a recent success story at this level with the Intergovernmental Task Force on Animal Feeding that has succeeded to produce 2 important guidelines, the first one being the guidelines on application of risk assessment for feed, and the other one on guidance for use by government in prioritizing their national feed hazard. These are definitely 2 important benchmark documents in order to foster global dialogue and consistency. But I believe that they might not achieve the immediate harmonization that we might be looking for, especially for the most advanced regulatory systems. This task force had a 6-year mandate. It was a temporary task force, which is now terminated. And practically, the feed is back to having no home in the Codex Alimentarius. We are spread somewhere in the organization. You can infer what's going to happen to the feed in this context. Even though there is still a substantial support for such international coordination, one might get the feeling that many jurisdictions tend to rely more on their own capacity and judgment to make their system evolving and use things like the Codex more on an indicative basis or as a means to influence other jurisdictions to follow their path. Without undermining the potential of this approach, I think there is a feeling at the global industry level that industry needs a deeper and a quicker pace for harmonization and for integration of the legislation than what can be achieved through these international bodies, whatever their remaining importance. So, which alternatives do we have? We are not just going to cry and say, okay, the world is terrible. As FEFANA, we identify at least 2 such alternatives, and we engage actively in working on that. The first one is industry-driven international standard, and the second one is fostering convergence between the jurisdictions. First one, international standard. I think I can claim that the work done by the specialty feeding ingredient industry with FAMI-QS is a clear, successful story. I like to clarify that this relates to the quality and safety system, so the production condition of specialty ingredient, not the product authorization. The European Union was clearly ahead of the other regions in this area with its feed hygiene regulation, both from a safety assessment point of view and from the operator self-responsibility point of view. At that time, when we got this regulation, the industry came to the conclusion that we can hardly see how these expectations that were introduced in the law can vary from one region to another region, and how far we can create competition on this basis. And that was, in fact, the basis of a kind of movement to go for a proactive and voluntary implementation of this legislation by the industry. The initiative was actually just slightly ahead of the developments in a number of regions. I mentioned US, China, but other regions are on this path as well. And this is now the basis for a growing synergy between this initiative by the industry and the public authorities. Somehow there, the industry just slightly preempted on the expectation of the regulator, prepare the field, and design what makes sense for the industry and is then recognized by everybody who cares for the safety of the feed chain. In a nutshell, the system includes different elements. There is a reference normative document, that's the code. It developed a robust third-party certification system based on a network of professional certification bodies. There is a big investment in training, both for the operators and for the certification bodies, and a clear set of rules, both for the operator and the certification bodies. And for the trust reason, there is a very robust supervision system and accreditation by official control authorities. After only 10 years of existence, the system now includes more than 800 operators from all parts of the world, a bit like you today, who voluntarily entered into this system. In the first place, it was intended to help harmonization and implementation on the European market. Very quickly, we realized that the system was a very useful tool for the operators in third countries to fulfill their obligation in order to be able to import product in Europe. And now, what we see is that the system is making its own life and is becoming a very important tool for economies that has nothing to do with Europe. So Colombia, China, United States, and so on and so forth. So what we have here is a global system for a global business that is fueled by the industry expectation and supported by those expectations of the authorities. The second area of moving this regulation is the convergence of regulatory system. When I'm talking about convergence, I'm talking about compatibility between systems and not having systems that are identical. Here we speak about product authorization by comparison of the certification system I mentioned. When we developed that, we had the feeling and we had indication that there was a kind of a willingness or even desire from a number of regulatory authorities to benefit from the experience of the others as a way to optimize the resource, being the public resources, but also the private resources. The big advantage of this approach on convergence, so you don't need to agree exactly on the content, is that there is no loss of sovereignty on the side of the regulatory bodies. They keep control, they keep the decision, but they look around what the others are doing, and this has proven to be a very powerful approach. We developed this project inside IFIF, the International Feed Industry Federation, in cooperation with our colleague from the Canadian and the American feed associations. So what we established there is a continuous cooperation between the regulators of the 3 regions and our industry. We are doing that for a bit more than 5 years now. We start modestly by sharing knowledge, and then we went into a more trust-building exercise and going deeper in the regulation, so to understand, analyze, and exchange on the regulation of the different countries. Funny enough, what we realized through this job is that the commonalities were much higher than we initially anticipated. So the way to go is probably less than one could fear when you enter into this kind of approach. And we are now at the point where we are really contemplating and even starting working on the possibility of guides and orientation documents that would have an international value for the authorization of the product under the different jurisdictions. Of course, this needs visions, this needs times, this needs sustained resource. We are talking about time scale of years, but it proves to work if we want to work and to go in this direction. It's sometimes a bit frightening to take a height perspective. Our industry is definitely a global industry and suffers from silos and system incompatibilities. Those involved in this area know that in regulatory affairs in a country, obtaining any change is a matter of a few years, of the order of 5 years, things like this, to give a range. The global context is submitted to another time scale, which is probably 2 or 3 times slower than local regulations. The man who has done that, you appreciate that the first step is probably, and is sometimes a bit difficult to make, but hopefully this might deliver extraordinary perspective. Improving the situation and the consistency of the global legislation requires patience and determination, but our experience clearly shows that it works and it's worth the effort. So I'd like to conclude, let's fly together. Thank you very much.
Didier, thank you very much for this presentation. Thanks a lot. So, where are the questions? I'm sure you have plenty of questions for this presentation. Oh, got one over there.
I'm Cheryl McCrindle from South Africa. I'm very interested in what you have to say, and I was with the International Dairy Federation for a number of years, so I understand well what we're talking about. However, I would just like to ask how what you're proposing, which is getting a little bit away from Codex, falls into ISO, International Standards Organization, and also the OIE, the International Federation for Animal Health, because both of those have almost aligned themselves to the Codex norms. And I do understand that ISO is quite strong in being suggesting standards for everything, probably including feeds.
Oh, yeah, I think you touched to 2 aspects of the presentation. One is the standardization. The other is the place of Codex versus what we can do in other circumstances. Clearly, standardization, there are initiatives, and certainly on the ISO side. What we have realized in our sector is that the ISO work, if we think about the ISO 22000, for instance, I suppose that's what you are referring to, it's a good basis. But this is lacking the sectorial knowledge and the knowledge that the sector can put in such a system. This is the reason, actually, when we developed FAMI-QS, we decide to restrict the scope to what we know. So what is behind is the industry, is the know-how of the industry which is behind and which is shared between the companies to get to the best possible level of the safety management. It's very difficult, not to say impossible, to reach such a level when you have a generalist system. So you see, there is no contradiction. When you look at FAMI-QS, it takes the structure, it takes the element, it takes the philosophy of an ISO 22000, it's embedded, but it goes beyond what an ISO 22000 is able to do. And in fact, the perspective is a little bit the same when you look at Codex. I certainly don't want to undermine the value of what is done, but when you look at the kind of document I'm mentioning, it's nice. But for those jurisdictions that have an evolved regulation, that's really the basics of the story. You cannot build on that. You need to go beyond. And that's where there is a certain degree of frustration, both for the global industry and for these jurisdictions that are a bit ahead, to progress at the slow pace of the Codex, and where we are looking for alternatives. The kind of initiative I mentioned on the Convergence is to a large extent similar, and we are considering going in this path, similar to what the pharmaceutical industry has done at global level with the VICH. So at some stage, they realized that they wanted to foster this convergence. They brought the regulator together with the industry. In their case, they formalized the relationship, and that's something we have in mind, honestly, so that there is a dialogue, and these bodies are producing documents which becomes reference for the regulations that are interested in that. And then there is a voluntary opening and approach by other jurisdictions that might be interested in the work which is done by this kind of leaders in this kind of activities.
Any other question? Well, I have a question as well. You know, there is this very emotional discussion going on at the moment in Europe with the TTIP, you know, the transatlantic trade and investment partnership between the European Union and the United States. What role does FEFANA, IFIF plays in this negotiation? As you know, we talked about global harmonization. So what is your input on that negotiation?
We are definitely in touch with the people who are negotiating. We have to recognize that we are a relatively small sector, so it's quite difficult to engage in this kind of very horizontal and broad discussion. We were actually approached by the European authorities in that respect because they realized the value of the things we are doing. And somehow they were interested to link our initiative on convergence to the kind of things they are talking. As a kind of past example and a proof that indeed things can be achieved. Of course, today, you might have seen the objection of the consumer organization and so on. The harmonization would be stumbling on big political and societal discussion, being GMOs and treatment of carcass, things like this, which are unlikely to settle in an easy way. We are in an area which is much more technical to a certain extent, and where dialogue and conversion between the regulatory system are possible. And that's where we see the link with this TTPI. So we are definitely in touch with them, even though clearly not on a daily basis.
Thank you very much, Dr. Didier Jans, for your presentation. Thank you.
Pleasure.